Today, we welcome Sara Yerkes. Sara is serving the International Code Council, ICC, as Senior Vice President of Global Relations. Her duties include overseeing public policy and government relations functions of the organization, developing and implementing a proactive program of effective lobbying and persuasive advocacy, representing and speaking for ICC on policy matters and program activities, and coordinating the strategies to implement policies at the federal, state, and local levels. Sara oversees the state and local activities that have successfully gained the adoption and use of the international codes in all 50 states, U.S. territories, and by federal agencies, as well as overseeing programs like plumbing, mechanical, and fuel gas programs, resources for codes adoptions, and fire service activities. What are codes and standards? How are codes different from standards, and what are the elements that make the governmental consensus process different from the standards development process? We're delighted to have Sara here today to discuss with us this important topic. So for those listening along, we look forward to your questions and engagement during the presentation. I'll be tracking the chat during the presentation, and so please post your questions there or send me a private chat as we go along. At this point, I thank you, Sara, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar and present to you about codes and standards. It's been my life for almost 40 years. And when I started in this area, I used to think, how can we make codes and standards more sexy? It's not exactly a sexy subject, but I learned throughout the years that it can be very dynamic and passionate. So I've truly enjoyed my work in this area. I think first I'll start with a little bit of an overview about the International Code Council. Karen, if you could go to the next slide, please. We are a not-for-profit association, a 501c6. We develop model codes and standards, and we do this by promoting and advocating and providing services to support the codes, and that's how we subsidize the development and maintenance of the model codes. It's not an inexpensive enterprise. It's costly to keep these codes maintained up to date. We publish a revised edition, updated edition every 3 years. So it's a continuous process. And as I said, we provide a robust infrastructure to support the jurisdictions that use our codes. And we'll get into more details as we go along. And I encourage you all to ask questions on the chat. Don't hesitate to interrupt me, Karen, if questions come up that you think I should answer at the moment. So the next slide, please. The codes that ICC develops are model codes. They are meant to be revised and adapted by the jurisdictions that adopt them. And we respect that. We respect the authority of the jurisdictions to amend the codes to fit their special climatic, geographic, or whatever other local needs they may have. What we don't like is when we see jurisdictions amending the model codes down, because the model codes form the basis. They're already the basic requirements. And sometimes we call them minimum requirements. I don't like the word minimum, so I prefer to use the base requirements. Going beyond code is always good, and we support that. Now, the process in the United States is very diverse. There's not a one size fits all. There are states that adopt statewide through legislation, other states through rulemaking. We have home rule states that let the jurisdictions decide if they want to adopt and enforce at the local level. And then we have states that have statewide adoptions for, sorry if you hear noise, it's out on my street, states that adopt for state-owned or leased buildings. And then they leave it up to the local jurisdictions to adopt or not. So what we offer with the I-codes is a common format. And this is the reason why ICC was formed back in 1994 when the 3 regional organizations decided to create ICC. And then in 2003, we finally consolidated the 3 organizations into what is now the International Code Council, to provide one set of model codes for the entire country so that an engineer or an architect from California could practice in New York or North Carolina or Ohio, because the codes based on the I codes follow the same common format. Chapter 11 in every single code, whether it's a customized code or a code just based on the model code, Chapter 11 is accessibility. So the architects and engineers know exactly where to go anywhere in the country for that information. Next slide. Now, under federal law, there's no difference between a standard and the code. So we kind of fall under the same designation in the federal regulations for the principles that we have to abide. Okay, we have to abide by certain principles in order to be considered national voluntary consensus standards. So the governmental consensus process is very unique in that it's very much like rulemaking. Everybody can participate, anyone can submit a code change, you can come and vote at the code action hearings, which just finished in this month, we just held them. But the final vote, which is usually at the public hearings held in the fall, at those hearings, only the public officials that represent their jurisdictions are permitted to vote. And the reason for that is to avoid special interests, undue influence in the process. So we like that the final vote is just by those people that have no financial vested interest other than public safety. Okay, the US standard strategy is complicated for various reasons, not just because the standards are developed in the private sector, but because it's a sector-based system. What that means is that we recognize that there are different needs. Each sector, each industry has its own specific needs. You cannot take 3 years to develop a standard for the Apple phone, the iPhones, right? It would be ridiculous, just no way. That technology changes so fast, they use different methods of developing their standards. There's a Canvas method, and there are many other methods, but for the purpose of construction and safety standards, we follow the OMBA 119, and the process that ICC uses is a 3-year process. It's a continuous, it's a vicious cycle. It never stops. So we just put out the 2021 codes in the fall of 2020. Immediately in January, calls went out for applications, nominations to serve on committees. We've already had hearings in the spring. We'll have hearings in the fall, and the 2024 codes will be coming out probably end of 2023. So it's a continuous process. And some people think it moves too fast, other people think it moves too slow. But the fact here is that the United States is very flexible. Our process or the strategy in the United States is very flexible in order to meet the demands of an industry or a specific sector, business sector. And why are these standards so important to the US economy? Well, they look after health and safety issues. So they protect the consumer by demanding that these products comply with these standards. They promote public good. They enhance the competitiveness of the US industry, and this is very important. And then we all benefit from this system, and we can all play a role, because these processes, whether the model code development process or the standards process, are open to everybody's participation. Next slide, please. I already talked about the federal law that requires federal agencies to use the private sector national consensus standards. And that's important that if we remember, it's got to be national consensus standards that the agencies use. And this started back some years ago, probably in the 80s and 90s, when the Department of Defense had so many standards, was so bogged down, the government was so bogged down with keeping up with the private industry, the private sector. I remember when I worked for an FPA, and I left an FPA in 2000, 2001 to come to ICC, I was finding references to NFPA standards published in 1934. So not just 3 years behind, but decades behind. But the federal government was having a tough time keeping up with the updates to the standards and codes. And DoD really was sort of the agency that really pushed this public law and the OMBA 119 to encourage the agencies to move from military specs and government standards to the private sector standards. And we all benefited from that because now obviously the federal government is using our model codes. As I mentioned, State Department, DoD, US Capitol, they all base their building requirements on the I codes. The next slide, please. Okay, this just gives you a little bit of history on the OMB A119. It was originally signed in 1982 and then it's been revised several times. I've been involved. That tells you what kind of a dinosaur I am. I've been involved in a lot of these creations and revisions. It's kind of scary to think about it. I don't know where time has gone, but it's the truth. And anyway, we update these documents. We get groups together, usually under the umbrella of the American National Standards Institute and NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They play sort of public-private partnership role where NIST represents the federal agencies and ANSI represents the private sector standards developers. And we come together, private sector and public sector, and update these documents. It goes through Federal Register and for public comment and the way rulemaking usually goes through. Next slide, please. Okay, so the definition of a standard in the code, and I already said that there's no differentiation in the federal laws between a code and the standard. We all fall under the same definition. Now, if you were to have asked me this back in the 80s, I would have said there's a big difference between a code and the standard. Because back then, there was still, it was still thought that the code would use mandatory language, legal language. So we would use words like shall. There was no gray area. You know, the code would tell you exactly what you had to do and how you had to do it. But now the standards have also become more legal documents. And they've started using the same terminologies, the same legal language. So the difference is sort of been erased. Now, the difference between a model code and the standard is still big. A model code provides a regulatory framework that the jurisdictions will use. And in that regulatory framework, the standards are referenced. So the model code drives also the use of the standards. The model code will say where to construct, how to construct. The standard will say how you install, how you maintain, you know, the installation and maintenance standards that the code references. And the model codes reference hundreds of standards from an FPA, from UL, and many others. So again, regulatory framework, referencing standards to complete the whole picture, and you can put up a building from the ground up until the occupants move in through these codes and standards. How you can participate. We put out a call for nominations to serve on the standards development committees. The board of directors of ICC appoints the committee. We're just going through that for the International Energy Conservation Code. We received over 340 applications, and now we're going through that process. The slate will be presented to the board, and the board then will make the final decision. For the standards process, we produce the initial draft, gets posted. Everything is very transparent and posted online. So everything will be conducted through CDP Access, which is a cloud-based process that allows participation from the comfort of your offices. You can sit at your computer and propose code changes. You can have a discussion with your colleagues and partners and get support for your proposed changes and so on. So after the draft is posted, the committee reviews the proposals. It either approves, disapproves, or sends back for additional work. If additional work is needed by work groups, these work groups are formed, and the process allows for a lot of discussion, much more than the governmental consensus process, which allows you 3 minutes to testify at a public hearing. With the standards process, it's a committee-driven process, so there's a lot more opportunity for discussion and debate, which is why we think it'll be appropriate for the Energy Conservation Code, because that's a code that involves a lot of changing technologies and methodologies, and more discussion is needed than what's allowed through a governmental consensus process. The meetings are open. The next slide, please. Okay, so continue on how you can participate. So there's a public comment draft. The committee publishes this draft and receives public comment. The committee then reviews and addresses the public comment. And the repeated public comment period on the revised, they repeat the process if they feel that it's needed for the revised draft. So they will continue to have public debate if necessary. There's a committee ballot once all the comments are resolved, and the committee votes on the approval of the document. And then the standard is published. Either it's a new standard, brand new, or it's an updated standard. But the process is the same for creating a new standard as it is updating the standard. We go through the same public comment period, public review, committee review, and so on. So it's very similar for the update as it is for the creation of a new standard. And the codes are only as good as they're implemented. You know, if they are just books sitting on a shelf, they're not going to make much difference. So my work here at ICC has been to work with the jurisdictions. I started with the 2000 edition of the codes, and we saw them widely accepted throughout the country. And you know, I have a lot of respect for the public officials that give their time, devote their careers to public safety. They're sort of unsung heroes, and we don't notice them because the buildings are safe. The only time they're noticed is if there's a catastrophe or a building collapses or a crane falls against the building or something, and then there's a story in the newspaper. But our code officials are committed individuals, very dedicated, and I have a lot of respect for them. So with that, Karen, I don't know if there are questions. I saw quite a bit of chat going on, so tell me what folks want to know.
Because with my final question, I wanted to ask you, you know, what trends are you seeing? What is that future of code development? You mentioned a couple of codes that you're working on now, but are you seeing specific areas with a lot of growth? You know, is there certain changes that are kind of bringing on a lot of movement in the codes area?
Well, you know, Karen, we've seen so many interesting things happen lately. Tall wood buildings. You know, you can put up a 14-story building constructed of wood. You know, we're seeing a lot of these technology. We're hearing conversations about using containers, you know, like the ship containers for construction, for home building. Not just here in the United States, I heard it in Europe as well. You know, there's always something changing. I think our community is much more attuned and aware of the environment. You know, where before we used to say, you know, how's the weather going to impact this building? How do we build it so that it can sustain the climate and all? Now we're saying, you know, how is this building going to impact the environment and the climate? So you know, I think we're much more attuned to these things. And I see it with my son, who's 30 years old. You know, when I bought my house, I looked for certain things, but I certainly wasn't thinking about, well, is this recycled wood, or, you know, am I using woods and materials that are friendly to the environment? I didn't think about that. I started thinking about it when ICC built its space in Washington, D.C. We're in the Realtors building on the 6th floor, and I had the privilege of overseeing that construction. And I learned so much, using paints that are safe for the environment, and locally harvested woods, and recycled carpet materials and things like that. So we're learning a lot of these things. I think that's having an impact in the building codes. I think the building codes will be more forward-thinking when it comes to natural disasters and sea rising and things like that. Where in the past we've said, we learn from lessons learned, right? We develop the codes based on what's happened in the past. But I think now we're also being more visionary and trying to advance and think, okay, how can it be better moving forward? But this is where all the science comes in. This is why we need the government, the federal agencies, and the academia and other folks that do research to bring that technology and information to us. So I think we're going to see a continuance of care for the environment, more creativity. And I know electric vehicles are a big deal, the charging stations, all these issues that were presented to the Energy Conservation Code and that are already in place in some building regulations, like in California. I think you're going to start seeing a lot of this stuff. You can't prevent progress, Karen. I think, willingly or not willingly, kicking and screaming, we are going to get to, the codes are not the same little pocketbooks that people had in their shirt pocket decades ago. Somebody told me that once. So, well, the codes are so complicated now, you got volumes and, hundreds of pages. It's like, yeah, it's, I heard the story in Chicago when the mayor did the formal adoption of the update to the IBC. There was a presentation that said when Chicago first developed its building code, it was 11 pages long. And the Chicago Tribune said it was way too long. So.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And I think that is a great way to end it for sure. A lot of exciting things in the future and coming ahead, and everyone clearly, based on the participation today, this is an important topic, an interesting topic, a lot of individuals looking to get involved. So our thanks to you, Sara, for giving this very helpful presentation on codes and standards and the differences and how they're developed. I've learned a lot, and I very much appreciate your being here today. And thank you again to our attendees for joining us, as well as our sponsors for supporting our work here. We will be posting this later to the Women in Standards YouTube channel, and we do have some exciting events coming up in the next couple of weeks and months, so please visit to take a look. I will email everyone when the recording is posted, and my thanks again to you, Sara, and everyone for joining us.
Well, thank you, Karen, again, for allowing me to be part of this program. And I invite every organization attending this webinar to get involved in the development of codes and standards. Your participation is important, and it's through the volunteers participating that we develop the best model codes and standards in the world. So thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your night.